Sean Gaillard is a music lover. He's a leader. One of the deeper public thinkers that I've come across. He reached out to me first to interview me about Play All Night. And we had one of the most wonderful conversations I've ever had about my book and its impact. He really delved deep into that. The other thing Sean and I have in common, other than music and leadership, is the fact that we're Southerners. The other thing about Sean, in addition to being an absolute lover of the Allman Brothers band and, geez, of all kinds of music, he is probably one of the biggest Beatles fans in the history of the world. And not in an obsessive way. It's a real gentle way that I find I tap myself very much into. I kind of feel that way about how I roll with the Allman Brothers band. Sean and I had a wonderful conversation right after Play All Night came out. It was one of my favorite interviews about the book of all time. I'm really pleased to have turned the tables on him here and have Sean Gaillard at the crossroads to discuss Southern music history and culture. But man, Tedeschi Trucks Band, and Dwayne played on that song with Aretha Franklin. It Ain't Fair. So for them to like drag this song out of the annals of history, it ain't fair. And they make it sing, man. And I was like, okay, it ain't fair. I felt like that was a good way to sort of segue into hanging out a little bit.
Yeah.
And saying hello. So first of all, I'm going to do an intro later about, sort of identifying us, who we are as fellow travelers. This is a podcast conversation for a podcast video, also called Conversation from the Crossroads of Southern Music History and Culture.
Great title.
Thank you. And it plays off of the name of my Substack, which, is thank you. And, one of the things, Sean, I was thinking about as I went into like this season of life was, number one, I wanted to do this for a while. I've been dabbling in video content for a while. It's weird. I'm sure you know the feeling, because you really put yourself out there in that medium. And then I started thinking about all of the interesting people I know and all of the great conversations that I have. And I was like, this kind of forces me to have good conversations with my friends at different times, to ponder the things that I think about, music, history, culture, as a Southerner, as a person living in the South. And then it just sort of grew. And I think you know this, right? Any good idea in a creative space, you have more ideas than you know what to do with right out of the chute.
Exactly.
I could have called you in 6 months and had this banger interview, but it was like, no, I won't talk to Sean now. Because I'm feeling compelled to reach out and say hello and check in on the other fronts. So how are you? What is the good word from the trenches? And you're in North Carolina. What part of North Carolina again?
I'm in the Piedmont Triad area, so probably the most identifiable town is where I grew up, Winston-Salem. And I live in a town, small kind of hamlet, if you will, next to Winston-Salem, town called Clemens. And Winston-Salem, clearly, tobacco center, R.J. Reynolds. And, musically speaking, because I know you are a historian and a musicologist and all good things. So in terms of crossroads, Bob, or intersections, if you will, this Winston-Salem is the home of Ben Folds, of the Ben Folds Five. And, he would be your kind of cat to have on this show. And Ben and I had a bit of a crossroads several years ago where I was the principal at the middle school that he attended, not at the same time, but
Right.
we dedicated the band room to his mentor and music teacher, Chick Shelton. And Ben couldn't make it. He was in Australia or touring, and I had the honor of reading his letter to the audience during that dedication. So that was really cool. So you got Ben Folds. Then you have the Five Royales, the great 50s R&B, early R&B,
Mm-hmm.
doo-wop kind of a group. Very famous for, I think they may have been the first. I'm not sure, man, but they did the song dedicated to the one I love, which the Mamas and
Right.
Papas had a hit. And I'm also, and gosh, I don't know the name of the guy, man, but the guitarist in that band was a huge influence on Hendrix. Huge. Um, Gosh, what was
Yes.
his name? Oh my
I'll
God.
look it up while you're talking.
Yeah,
Excellent. Yes.
huge influence on Hendrix and when he was a kid, and was cited in kind of his small number of guitar heroes. So, which I'm always fascinated by because, as you know, Hendrix, guitar hero to so many. Who were his heroes? Who were his influences? And then
Yep.
kind of the third intersection of music, and I know there are others in Winston-Salem, crossroads wise, but REM recorded, if I'm not mistaken, their first three studio albums here in Winston-Salem, produced by Mitch Easter,
Yep.
who had a kind of a alt rock band of some fame in the '80s. Let's Active. So some just neat intersections
Right.
of music here. Definitely nowhere near Nashville, Memphis, Macon, New York, or LA, but again, our kind of small claims to fame. And I don't know, man, if maybe the Almonds played here, or the Almond Joys, or Hourglass, probably, on the Chitlin circuit. I'm sure. I'm sure.
Yeah, and yes, there. I could probably look that up too while we're talking. So it was Loman Pauling was the
That's it.
guitarist. Also, apparently, Jimmy Page, Clapton, and Steve Cropper. If this little thing that shows up on my search says so, like he was an influence on guitarist. Did not know Winston Salem. Um, you are like, I mean, I'm a Beatles fan. Like I'm a serious Beatles fan. You are you don't I don't even rival you. And that's not I'm challenge or anything.
No,
But
man.
I feel every bit of your love for the Beatles. And I share it. Talk to me. Let's talk about the greatest, because there was the world and then the Beatles came. And I mean, we know we can talk about all that they built on. You and I both know you get in as deep as you want to, but the fact of the matter is, from the minute they hit until they stopped, they were constantly reinventing. And you've capped, like, there was something about that you capture in your book, The
No.
Pepper Effect. But it all starts with the music.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, I was thinking, I played in your honor. I listened to Let It Be. I know that's
Oh,
your favorite. I
it's
started
my
there.
favorite album. I've got my Let It Be coffee
I
mug.
did not miss it. I did not miss it. And I played that this morning, and then I was listening to a buddy of mine gave me a stack of records, and I grabbed this scratchy old white album and played the first side of that. And
Nice.
I was like, all right, I'm just in prep for talking to Sean. I was like, what, the questions I want to ask a fellow guy who's as nutty about this as I am. So
Well, pal, I in prep for this and a little bit of synchronicity. Apologies to the police. Um, I played because what the Beatles are to me, or what the Almonds are to you,
yeah.
And so it's like we have like this hot musical hierarchy, right? And for you, your launch pad, your landing space is the Allman Brothers, and within that landing space of yours, which I remember when we talked about this, there's a certain 12 minutes of a certain version of Mountain Jam that serves as like your DNA, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's and it is, and that's kind of where we locked in because I've never met anybody who got those 12 and 13 minutes of Eda Peach's rendition of the Allman Brothers, because that to me is to me is the definition. If we were to have an Allman Brothers dictionary, and we were to look up hitting the note, then it would be C 12 minutes of Mountain Jam, right, man? So
Yep.
you're there, and for me the Beatles, and I'll kind of, for me it's these small moments, maybe not as elongated as those 12 minutes, probably the closest being side two of Abbey Road, but these kind of small moments that kind of capture me and captivate me. The bass line to Dear Prudence, you mentioned the White Album. There's that moment there. There's that moment on the rooftop. Where you hear them playing, and you see it in the Get Back documentary where Paul and John are like, we're really doing this. There's just like these the small moments, and in the Allman Brothers, to me,
Mm-hmm.
part of like that 12-minute thing is a mistake, is when Butch Trucks comes in late, and you hear him like,
Yes,
whatever
sir.
profanity he's uttering, and he's probably looking at Jaimoe like, hey man, where are we, where are we, where are we, and Jaimoe's like, hey, come on man, I got you, I got you, I got you. And then you hear
Yes.
that just firm snare kick in from Butch, and it's like, and the count in, and third stone from the sun, and we're there, right?
Yep.
So for me, the Beatles, it's just those kind of moments that to me remind us of what it means to be human,
Yes,
reminds
sir.
us to be joyful in the path. It's the divine connection that holds us all together. So to the point where we really haven't had a conversation in 2 years, but we're picking up where we left off after Dwayne's counting, right? So either I'm the Jaimoe to your Butch, or you're the Butch to my Jaimoe, and here we are, you know, riffing along like 2 years has not passed.
Right.
That's to me the thing that keeps me going, are those moments, and seeing those lessons and values in the Beatles, which have influenced my life, and again, that led me on a pathway to all kinds of things. So in preparation for this gig, I listened to two songs. I pulled out my well tired copy of the Dreams box set and put on Rain by Greg Allman with the choir.
Ah,
His cover of that wonderful B side of Paperback Writer, which just hits on so many levels, and also in many ways, I it echoes one of your Substacks where you wrote so beautifully about Southern Blood. And I thought, man, if only he had taken Rain and reworked it a little bit, because it would fit so beautifully on his final album. And then the other song I listened to, and again, you and probably another friend of mine get this, is the Hourglass. And pre Allman Brothers, and where they on their second album, which to me is the best of the two, the Power of Love album, where they do an instrumental cover of Norwegian Wood, and
yes, sir.
Dwayne, young Dwayne Allman, is playing the electric sitar, and you hear not only echoes of that, but it's jazzed up, and there's a little bit of Brubeck in there, a little bit of Miles Davis, and you hear, kind of
Mm.
kind of like the early the kind of the sound that's in Dwayne's head about this kind of band that he wants to be in, right? Not quite there in the hourglass. You know, we've got a few things there. I got Greg's vocals, I've got his songwriting, but we're not quite there. And I just love like that Norwegian Wood, because you can just hear him, you know, putting together the equation. You know, or is it these guys? No, I don't know. We'll figure it out. Let me see if I, you know, we take it into this kind of, you know, waltz in the middle of the song where it gets all psychedelic and wonderful. So, my friend, I don't even know where we just landed. I'm waiting for Dwayne or Jaimoe to kind of, hey man,
I love it.
but that's it, brother.
I love it. So, quick note on Norwegian Wood. It just occurred to me. Warren Haynes, who is an encyclopedia of music and of the Allman Brothers. I mean, the thing about him and Derek is their understanding and reverence for the history and the past of that band rivals mine. You know, rivals.
Yeah.
I mean, well, you know, and that sounds gauche. It's too much of me to say, but I mean, it's similar. Like they value truly what that connection is and the history. Well, he throws in Norwegian Wood teases regularly. It's one of those that he'll do as a take a breath riff in the Allman Brothers
Nice.
almost.
Yes.
Oftentimes, you know, when they're off and doing something. And I would not be surprised, you know, it's probably a stretch that he would think about it through the hourglass lens, but it's another way the circle is unbroken, I guess is the best way
Hmm.
to say that. And Rain, thank you for bringing that up. But here's the thing, my buddy Steve, the one who gave me the records I was telling you about today, he said one time about a lot of Greg's solo stuff or a lot of Greg's tracks. Greg left a lot of unpolished gems.
Hmm.
Win, Lose or Draw is an example to me. I
Yeah.
do not care for the version that's on the album. Greg's got cocaine drip or a cold. I don't know which. It doesn't sound great.
Yeah.
And like, come on, re-record it or something. But the version that Eric Church did at the Greg Allman tribute show with Jack Pearson on
Mm.
guitar, Chuck Leavell was playing on keys, who's on the original version, you know, is transcendent.
Mm.
Uh and you know, going back to Southern Blood, and then I want to go back to the Fabs. You know, Greg always wanted to record a all songs by album, Gregory L. Allman, and kind of ran out of time.
Yeah.
Greg was also not the most prolific solo artist. He was the epitome of the Furry Freak brothers, the laid back characters, you know, just that's how he did his life. But
Hmm.
man, he could have done Rain. He could have done One More Try. He could have done Dreams his own way. You know, like
Mm.
a Come and Go Blues. You know, like there were a
Yeah.
lot of songs he could have done. Like somebody had just thought about it and said, "Let's just go do your songs." Right? Like you're 60, 70 years old. Okay, back to the Fabs. Do you remember the first time? So this was a question I was listening to, and I was like, I'm going to ask Sean this. Do you remember the first time? I cannot place the first time I put a needle on a Beatles record and listened to it. I'm 100% certain it was my mother's albums at home. Do you have recollection of that moment, or when you're like, oh wow, these?
There were kind of two moments that come to mind. For me, 1978, maybe 79. I was 8 or 9 years old, and I remember hearing "She Loves You." Now, it wasn't by the Beatles. It was by a Beatles imitation band, and it was the promo for the the ill-fated Dick Clark produced television movie, The Birth of the Beatles, which it's kind of an interesting artifact, and it's a TV movie about the birth of the Beatles. So it's the Hamburg days and all of that. And I remember hearing that going, whoa, whoa, and then kind of losing. I was a kid. I was watching episodes of Chips and Laugh Olympics, right? So I
Yep.
carried on with my life, but that song stayed with me. And then 2 years later, um, fifth grade, we moved here to North Carolina, I remember, my fifth grade teacher. I'd gotten in trouble for using profanity, and she told me that I needed to listen to the Beatles, because I would learn. I would, and she was British, and so I would speak the Queen's English. So anyway, a guy down the street in my neighborhood had a very extensive record collection, and I remember, oh, he's got Beatle records. Um, so I went down. He was a little bit older than me, and very generous with his music. And he had the Red and the Blue album, and then the and Beatles rarities, and he lent those records to me, and the first needle drop was on the Blue album, and I remember and man, it was this opening notes of Strawberry Fields Forever, which kick off side one of that compilation, and I haven't turned back since.
That
So
changed your life.
changed everything.
Um, a lot of us have that Sherpa, that mentor into the rock. Like, this is what you should listen to. It's almost always an older brother, an older cousin, an older
Hmm.
kid down the street. And all right, I'm always struck by the generosity. The people who hold it tight as like some secret, I've like been like, yeah, come on, get over yourself. Like,
Yeah,
this is their gift to us, and in some ways, if it hits us, it's it's our obligation. I see it. It's my obligation to an artist that I like to share their greatness. I feel like, I think that's only like par for the course for what they're giving us. And I'll speak to you, right? Your various shows and initiatives and interviews that you do, like, they matter.
yeah.
That when I come across them and I, dig into one or another, like, it's like, yes, thank you. There's a fellow person. And I think it's the same with music. So it was this guy down the street. Are you the oldest sibling, or where are
No,
you in
I'm
birth order?
I'm second in the line, so I'm two of four.
So number one was not a huge music fan,
Not
or
not,
not a
not
Fabs
really,
fan? What? Okay.
not really. I mean, my older brother, um, you know, dug music, but he didn't necessarily buy music, and it was my parents who had the records and the cassettes. So, I grew up with Motown from my dad, and primarily the album "What's Going On," Marvin Gaye. So that was on a whole lot. Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes, the Spinners, War. Those things. Stevie Wonder. Those things were very much a part of my listening. And then my mother, who also appreciated Motown, but then she also appreciated pop music. So, Barry Manilow, the Carpenters, Sinatra, Bobby Darin. She was a huge Bobby Darin fan. Gladys Knight and the Pips, and the Bee Gees, and those things. So I had kind of very much Roberta Flack too. My God, I had very
Hmm.
much a '60s, '70s and a little bit of '50s. My mom was a big Elvis fan as well. So those were the records that they had. They didn't necessarily they weren't necessarily into the Beatles. That
Yeah,
wasn't
you
part of
found them
their.
on your own.
Yeah, I found them on my own. So, um, yeah, the Beatles weren't in their collection. Covers of Beatles songs. So I remember, my dad and mom being big fans. I'll drop this name, Kenny Rankin. I don't know if you remember or know of Kenny Rankin, but he was a
No.
Greenwich Village cat, guitarist, folk kind of guy, who then morphed into jazz and standards, and sadly he's no longer with us, died in the 90s. But he had a kind of a moderate hit with a song called Peaceful, which I highly recommend, kept coming out of the New York folk rock sensibility. But then he also would do jazz, bossa nova kind of things, and he did like a really cool jazzy version of Penny Lane. And I remember my mom and dad having that record, and I remember going, "Oh, that's may have been one of the first Beatle covers I heard." And then my mom had um, was a big fan of Sergio Mendes and Brazil '66. So I remember hearing things like their versions of "With a Little Help from My Friends" and "Fool on the Hill" and those songs. And I remember just thinking, that's kind of cool, you know. So those were kind of, that in and of itself was an education too, in terms of the crossover and power of the Beatles. But Kenny Rankin, I highly, the Kenny Rankin album in particular,
On
was
my
recorded
notes.
live with an orchestra, arranged by Don Costa, who was a big Sinatra arranger and producer. And there's a wonderful version on that album of the Stephen Bishop classic "On and On," which is amazing. But that's just a lush album. And he also covered "While My Guitar Gently Weeps" with a little help from my friends. But his version of Penny Lane, I highly recommend. But the Beatles, for me too, what was, not only, as an entry point. So we talked about Norwegian Wood. So what's the sitar? What is that all about? And
Right.
and so that led me on a pathway to Ravi Shankar, and then, oh wow, Within You Without You on the Sgt. Pepper album, where it's very much George Harrison exploring mysticism. I remember, Indian mysticism and religion and philosophy. And so that was kind of a pathway. Then seeing um, that the Rolling Stones covered a Beatles song, "I Want to Be Your Man." Well, who are these Stones guys? So then, and then of course, well, who inspired the Stones? Oh man, Muddy Waters. Who's this Muddy Waters guy? Wow, Little Richard was a big influence on the Beatles and Chuck Berry. So it just kind of, mushroom, pun intended, almonds,
Well played, sir.
into kind of different pursuits and things. And then the other thing was the fact that, now I'll speaking of the South, I, growing up in Winston Salem, I lived in the suburbs, and both I'm African American. I'm very light skinned, and if I were to grow my hair back, it would be a fro. And so, I went to Catholic school, and I was one of maybe three or four, besides my sisters and brother. I was one of maybe five kids of color in school. So I dealt with a lot of ignorance. I dealt with a lot of racism. I was told, I'll never forget this, when I was, starting to getting into the Beatles, and I was told by someone in my class, "You should listen to your own music. Why are you listening to white music? You should listen to your own music." And so then I would
Wow.
go, well, hold on a second, and I would start talking about Little Richard and Chuck Berry. Nobody knew what the hell I was talking about. Um, but but the fact that this band, these four white guys from Liverpool, were very much unabashedly covering Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Fats Domino, and Motown. Loved, Smokey. George Harrison worshipped Smokey Robinson and the Miracles. You know, uh, they worship Stevie Wonder, Paul McCartney and Stevie Wonder, later doing Ebony and Ivory. And then Paul McCartney. So for me, as a black person growing up in the South, all right, in North Carolina, seeing that, okay, you don't necessarily have to be in a segment. You don't, there's crossover and appreciation, and the fact that the Beatles put in, very famously put in their contract rider when they played in Florida, we're not playing to segregated audiences. So
Yep.
that to me gave me validation as a black person. That gave to me a sense of belonging and inclusion. And then when let's enter January 1969, we talk about the Let It Be Get Back sessions. Literally, Billy Preston, a black keyboardist, is literally pulled off the street by George Harrison and invited in to play with them. Wow. As a young kid of color, who's trying to, and again, I'm not dark enough. I'm not, I'm not light enough, and I'm kind of, trying to figure out where I fit. And here I am listening I wasn't necessarily listening to at the time, what my peers wanted me to listen to in terms of hip hop or rap or whatever. Now, again, I appreciated soul music, I appreciated jazz music, Coltrane, Miles Davis, those cats. But to me, the Beatles were this kind of this carousel of inclusion, right? In a carousel, like it's open and you can and anybody can come on it. And the fact that they took Billy Preston, who not only plays all over the Let It Be Get Back sessions, but he's the first person that they give credit to, an outside musician that they gave credit to on a single. So if you look up Get Back and Don't Let Me Down, that single, it's not credited as the Beatles. It's credited as the Beatles with Billy Preston. So for me,
did not know that.
That gave me, okay, if those guys will include Billy Preston, then maybe there's room for somebody like me. So then I began exploring different integrated bands. Let's go there with Booker T and the MGs. You have two white guys and two black guys playing together unabashedly, the height of the civil rights movement in Memphis. You have Arthur Lee, from Love, and Johnny Eccles, two black guys, from the South playing. Not only are they playing in an integrated band, but they are not playing soul and R&B music. They're playing folk rock. They're playing psychedelia. They're playing rock, and Arthur Lee is the front man, black guy, for the band. Johnny Eccles, he's the lead guitarist, black guy, right? And Arthur Lee wrote all those great songs on, Forever Changes, which, Robert Plant, considers to be one of his favorite albums of all time, integration, right? And then, one of my first needle drop, if you will, or the Allman Brothers, Ramblin' Man, that was my entry point. And then, the song Jessica, and then the fact that, wait a minute, they got a guy named, and you see it on it at Fillmore East, man. That meant something to me, man.
I usually have the album cover. Let me go.
Jaimoe, front and center, sitting there with the band. He's a drummer, and not only is he a drummer and a percussionist, he is, he's one of the first guys in the band, right? He's, in fact, I think he is the first. He
is employee number one.
He's number one, Dwayne St. Okay, there it is.
There we go. I should have had this handy. You mentioned this also. So go ahead. Let's talk more Jaimoe. Please keep going.
Yeah, that meant something to me. Here's Jaimoe, not in the background. He's not on the flip side. The roadies are, and which also has some merit and importance too. but the fact that you have got a black man sitting front and center in communion with the band, in communion with cats, from the Deep South, that representation, that meant something to me. So then I'm thinking, well, man, wait a minute. If the Almonds, who are from the South, and they were dealing, and I'm sure Dwayne and Greg, knew folks in the Klan, saw all kinds of different levels of racism and segregation. But the fact that Jaimoe was embraced in the band and he was the first to join, and he's given equal credit says something. And then we get into, the brothers and sisters era, and the fact that we have Barry Oakley has passed away. And then not only do you have Jaimoe, but then you have an African American bass player, right? And to see, you open up brothers and sisters, to me that meant something. And to see those two brothers, with
And Lamar Williams and Jaimoe grew up together as
That's
well.
right.
So like you have this, please keep going. Yes. I hadn't even thought
meant
about the
something to
opening.
me.
Yes. The gatefold. Yeah.
And
Please.
I love the scene, but I love the moment on it's on one of the archival Allman Brothers live releases, from that tour. I think it's 72, 73, and they're playing Mountain Jam. And, after Lamar's bass solo, to me, you want to talk about a moment when Greg Allman at the top of his lungs, after that solo goes, Lamar Williams, and it's just so freaking cool, right? Kind of, we talk about Crossroads. We talk about Crossroads being, Robert Johnson selling the soul of the devil. We talk about Crossroads being these kind of like, life or death moments or dark moments of the soul. But to me, Crossroads are all these intersections,
Yes.
where we're blending and melding, and you talked earlier about Mad Dog's Englishmen, and you have all of these bands that are freely breaking down walls and barriers, and in these kind of crossroads moments. We talked about Stevie Wonder. He wrote Superstition for Jeff Beck, and Jeff Beck later plays with Stevie. So I dig those kinds of moments. Rocky Dijon, percussionist, play black, playing with the Stones. Billy Preston also played with the Stones. So all of these things to me were lessons and validation that we don't have to be segregated. We don't have to be in tunnels, and we don't have to have a life that is rife with division and categories and strife and misunderstanding and racism and prejudice and all of those things. So those moments of music and those, just getting that crossroads moment, that meant a whole hell of a lot to me. Still does.
The intersections, and what sometimes you can call it from a more academic sense is your intersectionalities, right? The various ways that you are a Southerner, a Gen Xer, a Southern Gen X Beatles fan who also loves the Allman Brothers, like who also is an educator at heart. You're an actual, teacher in the realm, in the realm of public education, et cetera. The crossroads being also the place where a lot of things happen, a lot of activities and ideas come together. I wrote about this on Substack a while back because I did it as part of a academic presentation. What are the crossroads, right? Well, the concept in Southern culture comes from African culture, and the trickster and the crossroads, which is where we get the Robert Johnson story. And you're right, like can have that connotation. You got Dickie Betts talking about 7 turns on the highway that they're, what he learned from his mentor. Was there 7 key moments in your life when you make a transition or change, or something happens where you
Great
go.
album.
And yes, and music, like this was the piece, like there's a way that you see the world is how I see the world. You've actually helped draw it more out of me. Like, okay, the way that I see the world through this musical lens, whether I can sit and read your book, again, The Pepper Effect, tap into the magic of creativity, collaboration, and innovation, which is just a really great leadership lessons specific to the Beatles and the things they saw. I love books like this because they're just like, yes. I mean, my mother would give me devotional books from Florida Gator stories because my mother Trafficked in Devotional Books and Florida Gators, you know, and I loved both of those. It was fine to read some stories about some triumphs and stuff, right? Um, you've taken that to your own work within the leadership realm. Like this is something else. You and I don't talk a lot about this. Um, because we have so much better things to talk about than leadership and culture
Hmm.
in our organizations and institutions. But you've created a community around that topic that then branches out as you can talk about these various things, your various channels that you're doing. So
Hmm.
just, you know, music as a metaphor for life, music as it relates to you as you go. And I want, and your leadership, like your, like how you do, you know, your work. And by leadership too, like you can talk about your life and your family. It doesn't have to be just, you know, who the people that you lead.
Hmm.
And I want you to also, I want you to talk about community, how you find and nurture community for yourself and for your peers, because this is a nurturing community exercise for me. I
Hmm.
recognize that that's the MO of history museums and historic sites, this lifelong of my work. I told you earlier, I know all these fascinating, interesting people. Why not just talk to them about this and let people
Right.
think,
Yeah.
you know, just so I threw a lot at you.
No,
Uh,
it's so, you know, if we, how should I, I fell into teaching, not as um, a vocation at first. I fell into it as a holding pattern, and because I still hadn't figured out what I was going to do, and I've just kind of stayed with it for the last 32, 33 years. Um, but a lot of and I'm an English teacher. I teach literature, and that's my thing. And so, I found that music was an entry point, or is an entry point to connection. And I truly believe, there's all this talk and things about like the lost chord and we're getting into some Pete Townsend Moody Blues territory, but I truly believe that there is this kind of universal spark that connects all of us, right? And that's what we derive meaning from. So in literature, I mean, this is history. There's different frames to look through, and do we look at it through a structuralist lens? Do we look at it through a postmodern lens? And so for me in my English classes, I look through everything through music. So I started off like, if I was teaching Gatsby, I'd be like, well, what would be a good song for this scene in the novel where Gatsby and Nick are talking? And for teenagers and adolescents, music is very much, and it was for me too, part
mhm.
of their identity, right? And help shaped and defined us. So it started there, and then I thought, well, man, maybe I'll teach about the Beatles, and so I would do like these little mini units on the Beatles, and we'd have great projects and things, and it was just kind of a way to get that out there. And then as I became a leader and went into administration, um, I use storytelling as a just as I would as an English teacher. That stayed with me as a leader. So I would, probably sometimes to a fault, tell a yarn or story or two to help either build the vision and mission, to build us as a unit, to build us as a band. And I used a lot of music analogies, and I would tell stories about like when I was in my failed band in college, the Sky Dogs, named after Dwayne Allman's nickname. That was a nod to that. And I would talk about different things in order to say, well, even though the Sky Dogs, we got fired in the middle of a gig attempting to do the 20-minute version of Inagata Davida, that was the best we ever played, and we stopped caring, And I said it's the same thing in teaching, just sometimes if you just stop overthinking and just get into the moment and hit the note, great things could happen in the classroom. Great things could happen for the good of kids. So that just kind of stayed in the marrow, stayed in my leadership, stayed in me talking, and then I felt, well, man, there's a lot of lessons from the Beatles that I talk about. Why don't I curate those in some way, shape, or form? And for me, the Beatles is my thing, but it doesn't have to be everybody's thing. As long as you've got a thing, a passion, something that is gonna move your soul. So, I often talk about, as a leadership move, finding talent and building strengths. In my mind, John Lennon, age 16, made one of the greatest leadership moves in any band or organization, and that's the day that he met Paul McCartney. And Paul McCartney was a little pipsqueak 14, 15-year-old kid, had met John after his kind of floppy band, the Quarrymen, doing skiffle music, and they meet after the gig, and Paul brought his guitar, and famously plays 20 Flight Rock, the Eddie
20
Cochran
Flight
song,
Rock.
and John goes, whoa, wait a minute, this guy's a better player than me. This guy sings. This guy also writes songs. I do too. I'm the leader of this band, but even though he might be a threat to me and my leadership, he's actually going to make the band better. What a powerful insight for a 16-year-old, bloke from Liverpool to kind of figure out. Not many adult leaders, because you're driven by ego, you're driven by pride, so to me that was a powerful leadership lesson to share for leaders. If building your team, it's not about you, it's about the band, and it's about what's going to make the band better. Who's got the strengths to bring different things to the band. So going to the Allman Brothers, all of those cats came from very different musical backgrounds and sensibilities, right? Butch Trucks, we talked about Butch Trucks, classically trained, and his classical background, even though Dwayne probably, wasn't thinking Bach or Rachmaninoff or whatever, but man, I've got a guy that plays precisely. We need that. Barry Oakley, my God, if Miles Davis had discovered Barry Oakley before Dwayne did, we would be having a different conversation about Barry Oakley and his bass lines on Bitches Brew, right? Because Barry Oakley very much, that Charles Mingus melodic, jazz sensibility. And again, Dwayne, and then here's the other thing of this, man, is, we've talked a little bit about this before in the past. Dwayne's not a singer. Dwayne can sing, but he's not a singer. And even though this is Dwayne's band and this is his vision, man, I got Babro, right? I got Babro. I got my baby brother, who has got a voice that is going to unleash so much soul and blood, and he's up there with Howlin' Wolf and Leadbelly, and he can sing all those guys. He's going to be the front man, not me. It's my band. He's going to be the front man, right? So again, there's a lot of lessons that, even if it's not the Beatles, which it is for me, it can be the Allman Brothers. It can be the Florida Gators. It can be Starbucks coffee. It can be Sherman's March to the Sea. It can be Homer, whatever it may be. But if these things exist in our society, not as things on a shelf or things in a used bookstore, but we're supposed to derive meaning from, and purpose and inspiration, and so you swim in museums, man, those are we talk about museums as being a collection of outdated things that are dead. No, museum, those are living reminders of our humanity, and all the foibles and all the bullshit and the joys and the agonies and the ecstasies, and it's a reflection of who we are, and what we can be, and where we need to be. So the Beatles for me is that entry point. Their music is timeless and universal. just like Shakespeare, 100 years from now, people are still going to be listening to and talking about the Beatles and developing meaning. Allman Brothers, you taking the Allman Brothers, this band that people unfairly categorize as Southern rock, or hey, Ramblin' Man is that requisite track on a K-Tel Freedom Rock compilation. No, 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 no. There's a whole thing here. There's a whole universe to be mined, to derive meaning from. And I, am so passionate about this that I'm going to write my freaking dissertation about this, and I'm going to teach classes about this, and I'm going to put the Allman Brothers on the same level as Shakespeare, as guys that have equal weight and value. And again, Shakespeare, who decided that he was going to be to be up there? Well, a lot of human beings who derived meaning from that, and it just so happens this cat wrote beautiful words, and man, we're gonna keep talking about all the stuff in the first folio and so on and so forth. The Allman Brothers, they're in my mind, what you're doing and what you did with Play All Night, and what you're doing in your work and scholarship, man, there was no kind of bodhisattva on high that to stop you from doing that. No, these guys have meaning, and they mean something to me, and there's value to be seen in history and Southern culture and American culture. And why the hell not? Why the hell not? Why the hell not? Can we not put them up here? Right. This just isn't good, and this just isn't great music, but there's a story here. There's a story here of our reflection and our humanity. We've spent pretty much the better part of talking about the Allman Brothers as this kind of emblem for integration, which again is not original, is not new. We've been let's talk about the Greeks and the Romans, right? Romans we've been borrowing from the Greeks for centuries, right? And it's the same thing with the Allmans, man. We're going to take R&B, we're going to take jazz, we're going to take rock, we're going to take pop, we're going to take a little bit of folk, a little bit of Jackson Brown, and
Yeah.
and we're going to mix it all up. And it just so happens we are a brotherhood. Now brotherhood, and there's a lot of tragedy in the Allman Brothers, a lot of human tragedy, but man, their story is a reflection of what it means to be human, what it means to lead. Same thing with the Beatles. There's a lot of ups and downs and tragedy. My God, death, John being gunned down, George, being eaten to beaten to a pulp by cancer, and falling out in lawsuits and litigations. But again, there's examples from the Allmans and the Beatles and the Stones and the Dave Clark Five and the Monkees and all of these things that, for guys like us, serve as entry points of what it means to be human, what it means to lead, what it means to be in a band, what it means to collaborate, what it means to express and to be. And it just so happens the Beatles make beautiful music. It just so happens the Allman Brothers make beautiful music. And for anybody that's listening, this isn't about converting you to the Beatles or the Allmans. It's about opening you up to the human experience, our shared humanity, which, my God, during these days, we have a whole hell of a lot of division. We have a whole lot of folks that are saying a lot of junk about each other. We have battle lines being drawn, and now more than ever, we need to tap into that well of shared humanity that unites us. Find that common ground.
Amen. You just hit on every point I had to talk about. Like, I was just awesome because I have history, leadership. We've already talked about representation. That was so great you brought that up. Really important part of the toolkit of my world. We've talked a lot about representation in the history books from when you and I were growing up. We're about the same age, to now, to the things you're doing in school. And you know what? I'm going to tell you this. If representation didn't matter, they wouldn't be fighting so hard not to include representation right now. The last time we went through this, I'm trying to make this not timely, Sean. So like, I'm not going to talk about any specific event, but the last time we were in this administration, they dabbled with coming after museums and historic sites and didn't really think about it. They were much more strategic this time. And
Hmm.
I've got colleagues throughout the federal side of this. Private nonprofits and states are way more immune to these things. But if it wasn't a threat, they wouldn't be trying to take it away from us. It's just like public education.
That's right, man.
Um, you're like, I'm a child of public education. Fortunately, probably my children will probably be one of the last generations. I don't know. I don't. Like I'm sad that there's not more love for this. Because when I was a kid and they started talking about doing away with education funding and this and that, I'm like, wait a second. Like when I was little, like when we discovered the Beatles was also the time this question came up, and it was like that doesn't make any sense to me, because if you educate people, then that's only a good thing, like it keeps them out of jail and employed.
Uh-huh.
And of course I came up as a Southerner in the first generation of integration, so I was always in integrated schools. I think I started kindergarten in 1976.
Hmm.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
so right at that first time I went to school, but it was at home. That was a new concept that I had to somewhat grapple with, right? Like uh but you just hit on all of it. You just hit on every bit of it. And I think that with the ways that music draws us out of ourselves is really where I feel it. Like we can talk about it from a spiritual perspective, which you have dabbled with and I have talked about too. We can talk about it from just that, where you're sitting today, right? Like how you're feeling. When I play music with other people or have a jam like this is a
Hmm.
legit jam session.
Right
I'm
on.
feeling it, right? Like it's there. I'm tapping into something. And the piece when I talk to my peers in this show, I bring up this idea that I think that when we emerge and begin to seek community as an idea again, as humans, like I got to find some community. I got to get
Yeah.
back in touch with this long tail of humanity. The right institutions across the board, but particularly in arts and cultural sector, are going to be very primed to accepting that and being one of those vessels. My whole career, which is now 30 years in the public sector, we've talked about that as an ideal for ourselves. We want to be essential to this and that, and tried to, in many ways, inculcate, bring these conversations forward.
Hmm.
So I appreciate you saying that, Sean, because the synergy that is there. And I think that we're tapped, and it'll take. We talked about leadership, the right kinds of leaders who are brave in the moment and thoughtful and those things. Um, I always say leadership's a calling. You don't just become a leader and stay. If you become a leader and then stay a leader and just say, "Oh, I'm done," you're in earth school all the time anyway. But
Hmm.
man, when you are in leadership, to me, it's an obligation to make the world better, the best it can for the people that are working for you, trying to make the world better way more directly than you are. You're there just sort of, like Tom Dowd
That's
at
right,
Fillmore
man.
East, right? Like you're just,
Yeah.
hey, look, you guys know what you're doing. All I'm going to do is twist the knobs. When it's time to talk, we'll talk a little bit about course correction if we need to. No
Exactly.
course correction, right? Because Fillmore East
Exactly.
is 100% live. Or George Martin, all hail George, the great George Martin, whom we have not referenced yet today. So, we'll bring up, but the same deal, right? Like that's our role as leaders, is to facilitate the ease of achievement down the line. And you can't just say, okay, I'm a leader now, I'm done. You're in Earth School. You're in a
Yeah.
different level of Earth School.
Yeah,
I
man.
think it's a requirement. Um, and you draw like I do. Okay, I'm gonna stop. That's all you.
No, no, no. It's you nailed in the notion of community, and when you were talking about you know going to kindergarten in '76, and we're around the same age because that I started kindergarten at that time, and I think about how you and I grew up in a world where community and acceptance and belonging, even though it wasn't perfect in the '70s, and there were racism, is evident in different things during that time. Community and was prevalent. This is you and I came out of the first Earth Day. We got to take care of the world. We grew up with Woodsy the Owl, give a hoot, don't pollute. Iron Eyes Cody. The commercial with the, we grew up in different public service announcements about, Riff and reading is fundamental, and Sesame Street and Mister Rogers and the neighborhood and Sesame Street. Oh my gosh, there's all these folks that they're living together and working together, and same thing in Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And then, I think a lot of that is the aftermath of this kind of '60s utopian, mindset at the time. Yeah, some of it clearly fueled by psychedelics and such, but this notion, this response against segregation, this response against the generation gap, right? That's going on. So you got bands living together, Jefferson Airplane, Grateful Dead, festivals, Woodstock, Allman Brothers come out of that realm too, right? Living together in the big house in Macon, and then song, a song revival, Love Is Everywhere. I mean, great tune by Dickie Betts, but very much filled with this kind of '60s utopian community, and you see that, and the Beatles are responding to that. The Beatles are very much a communal unit, and so then the '70s, gosh, you and I grew up in all of that, and today, and I kind of to go back to an earlier question you had about this, you can't lead alone. And a lot of the segments that we have, I mean, it's due to cell phones. It's due to the digitalization of our world, and we don't talk to anybody, and we don't go to museums, and we don't read, analog books and those things. So, I learned very quickly as a leader early in my principalship that it's lonely. It's lonely as hell. And as much as I appreciate solitude and appreciate being alone and going through my Sinatra Man Alone phase or Neil Diamond Solitary Man, I still need a band, right? And so bands like the Allmans and Beatles, I got a lot of inspiration from, and I felt like the Faculty, we're a band, and we all have strengths to draw from. We have to build that community. Sometimes that's not always easy to do in an organization. So kind of like some of the side gigs, and I'm always fascinated when bands do side gigs. I just thought it was very interesting, like when Duran Duran broke up briefly in the '80s, and they split in half, and you had one group doing the Acadia, or is it Arcadia? I forget what it's called, but like that side project, and then you had the Power Station, yeah. And even the Beatles, they didn't necessarily, they spent a lot of time between when they stopped touring in Sgt. Pepper, where they kind of went their separate ways and experimented different. The Allmans, of course, you had Dickie Betts and Great Southern, kind of like this little, let me explore country swing and see what happens. Greg Allman, the Greg Allman Band, where, okay, I'm gonna play around with gospel. I'm gonna play around with R&B, and it's not necessarily gonna be the twin guitar approach. Sea Level, right? We talked about Chuck Level and Jaimoe and Lamar Williams and this kind of jazz fusion, Rain in Spain, cue it, baby. So the same thing as a leader. I had to kind of find different side projects and different niches and rabbit holes to get into to fuel my passion. because I might not necessarily gotten it in the daily gig that I was in, so that's why I wrote the Pepper Effect. That's why I did Principal Liner Notes podcast, Leadership Liner Notes podcast, now Vinyl Riffs podcast. Like, I'm doing these kind of different things to not only fill my own, creative bucket, but also to build community and to find connectedness, because leadership is lonely. You are very much marooned. Even though you're in the center of the hurricane, not everybody wants to be in a band. Think about Paul McCartney in the Get Back sessions. He's really trying to corral those guys together. Let's play
Yeah.
live again. We can do it. Let's be a band again. You think about that period of time between the death of Duane Allman and Barry Oakley, and I know you know about this, but all right, well, who are we? What do we become now? Our leader is gone. His strongest, one of his strongest ally, Barry Oakley, is gone. Who do we become now? And how do we fit together? So you have to kind of rebuild. That's a leadership lesson there, an organizational lesson there, and let's keep going. Along the lines is just a great thread in the almonds there too. So community is something that is really important. And if you've got a vision to build that, just like Duane did, in many ways, I feel kinship with Duane, because he just didn't do the almonds, right? We talked about, maybe before we hit record, about him, his session work with Aretha Franklin, his session, he and some of that he had to do for survival. But then he did this little thing, this little side project with this little known guitarist, Eric Clapton, Derek and the Dominoes. You want to talk about the side project of side projects, right? But I think Duane did those things because he, restless. He needed to, find rabbit holes. Some of it was survival and to pay the bills, but he loved music. He loved connecting with different people. My God, man, the fact that he convinced Wilson Pickett to cover Hey Jude, again, that's a whole, talk about integration and the connection to the Beatles and all these things that we've been talking about. A white guy, telling a black guy, I think I think this might be a good song for you to cover. I think we can do something. Well, man, probably the best known cover of Hey Jude. But then, if that didn't happen, man, let me tell you something. There's no Layla. Because Clapton heard the solo, Duane solo on Hey Jude, and said, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, whoa! Who's this guy? I gotta get this guy." So, I mean, again, that kind of breaking of barriers, that breaking of integration, or that breaking of segregation, rather. I mean, think about that, man. White guy telling Wilson Pickett, "You need to cover a song by the Beatles, Hey Jude," which is phenomenal, right? And Wilson, and nothing to take away from Wilson Pickett, but Duane Allman was the driving force of that song, and that solo at the end, which, God, who produced that, by the way? Was that Tom Dowd?
It's Rick Haw.
Yeah. Every time I hear that, I just, Rick, man, don't fade it out, man. Just don't turn it down.
Amen, brother.
Don't turn it down. Keep going.
Amen. There is a lot of that.
Please.
Yeah. There's too much of that in all of Duane's career, but certainly his Muscle Shoals career, because they fade out. Loan Me a Dime. Now that's over at Shoals Sound. That's not at Fame, but that is at 13 minutes is faded out. Like, apparently there were like 2 30-minute jams that they recorded that day, but tape is expensive, right?
Yeah.
So you're like, okay. The Hey Jude. So two things I was thinking about with that today going into it. First thing is, I only learned recently, and it may have been when Anthologies came out, or it was watching Get Back or around there, that George had suggested doing a guitar solo on Hey Jude.
That's right,
and Paul turned him down, and they went instead with the long coda. So I always think like, wow, Duane heard something that George heard too, like maybe, whatever else.
Good
The other
point.
one is a part of the story. You know me. I'm a collector of these great quotes. I've got great quotes from the same guy 4 different times about the same story with slightly different angles how they tell the story. Right? I got them all.
Hmm.
And the one recently that I used was Wilson Pickett's like, I ain't gonna cover no song about no Jew. That's it. That was initially what had happened.
Wow.
And then the discussion was, come on, man, this is the Beatles. This is ridiculous, etc. I'm not going to do that, and Rick Hall quotes Dwayne saying, "No, see, that's the thing. Proof that you as a black act have balls to cover the Beatles while they're still on the charts." So there's this little element, I think,
Wow.
of what we're talking about within just that recording. Um, and I so just to sort of wrap up on that side of things, I do love how you think about community, and I want to encourage others. Like I find community with you just sitting and listening to your stuff when I do. It's not I'm a regular at some things and not others, but what you're doing
Thank you.
is you're putting it out in the world to say, hey, come join me. This is a journey. And you teach others, I think, that leadership is not a finite thing. There's a responsibility to it that shines through. Hey, okay, the last thing I want to talk about, and I'm gonna let you go. I want you to talk about the South, being a Southerner. Your thoughts on that.
Well, I have a love-hate thing with the South. Um, I was born in California. My parents are from Chicago, and although those sensibilities are in my DNA, and proudly so, um, you know, the South is where I've been for the majority of my life, and there is the agrarian um, uh, placidity that I appreciate every now and then, and the pace. Um, a lot of and I've lived up north. I've lived in Boston for several years. My wife is from Boston. Um, Racism, segregation, all of those pieces, they're everywhere. You know, um, I would say my experience in the South, it was a little more direct. Um, Up north, it was a little more indirect. Um, and then there's shades of that as well. But I do I do sometimes um, you know wish that we could echo the better angels of our nature down here. And and if it doesn't just have to stop at music. So, what do you do when you break down that wall, Steven Tyler and Joe Perry of Aerosmith? When you break down that wall and you're looking across and you see Run DMC there, what do you do? And or what do you do? When you see your equivalent of Billy Preston or Aretha Franklin walking down the street. What do you do? But then most importantly, what do you do, you know, when you are the only one, or let me flip it. What do you do when you're in the room and the people that don't look like you aren't there? How do you refer to them? How do you talk about them? How do you drop that epithet? Do you drop that microaggression? And then if you hear someone doing that, how do you respond? That echoes the better angels of your nature, right? Um, right now, and I'm sure you get this as a historian. There is this move the last 5, 6, 7, whatever it is, 10 years, whatever it is, that, you know, racism's over.
Yeah.
It's over. We elected Obama, you know, and it's over. And you know what? I'm hurt too. I've been wronged. I've been wronged. Slavery wasn't that bad. So all of these kinds of, this kind of clutching of pearls. Lighten up. It was just a joke. I really believe, Bob, and I've said this to my wife and my family, we are one click away. We talk about like the doomsday clock, and we're like 1 second away from the end of the world. Well, I believe in America, we are 1 second away from the N-word being dropped in a very large public forum on a large public stage, and there's going to be it's just a word. Why can't I say it? You all say it. It's just a word. What's wrong with that? I really truly believe that, and we keep inching closer and closer. The more things that we're tolerating, and then the more things that the folks that kind of subscribe to that crap are defending and wait a minute, what's wrong with that? It's just a joke, I'm just telling you, we are just one click away from all of those things that Dwayne Allman fought for, all of those things that the Beatles fought for in accepting Billy Preston, all of the things that the folks that came before us, that the Freedom Riders and Dr. King and John Lewis, all of those, Jimmy Carter, all of those guys that put their lives and reputations on the line. I just feel like we're on the edge of an abyss that if we are not careful. Now, we recovered, post Civil War and Reconstruction, we recovered, and you and I kind of grew up a little bit in that kind of post 60s utopia of like, we're together and the world's it's a big blue marble, right? Remember that show? And all those things. God, I hope our grandkids and our great grandkids aren't living in a world where there's you're looking at a colored sign and you're looking at a white sign, and I just feel like we keep getting closer to that, and we keep playing around and flirting around, and now Charlottesville, well, they're good people on both sides. No,
Yeah.
no, no, they're not. No, they're not. That's not how that works.
The continued line crossing for me over the past decade. I think about that, right? My children really only know this Trump, all this craziness, and I don't disagree with your assessment there at all, because of so many of those standards of behavior that just continue to get blown through, of course.
Yeah.
I do know that history tells us, that there are breaking points to all fevers in history.
That's true.
That the hoses in Birmingham were number one, it was an intentional move by my hero Fred Shuttlesworth, the one civil rights giant I have met, who's also was a tiny little man, but Fred Shuttlesworth, calls the SCLC in, says this is the time because Bull Connor's going to take the bait, and that turned the tide. Did not turn the tide with my own grandmother, however. This would be my Scarsdale, New York grandmother, who said, we went to church that Sunday and the preacher said, we're responsible for this too, et cetera. This is pre my grandparents becoming evangelical Christians. So this would have been in the 63. And she goes, I just didn't see why I was responsible for that. I didn't. And I said, well, Grammy, so this was, 20, 30 years later, I'm a historian. And I was like, actually history says that, that those images really did shake up middle America across the thing. And God bless her. she was willing to accept that, like, I don't know that she would have listened to that 10 years earlier, but I guess the point being, what came, what I thinking about all of this, right? That is the thing about the South that I was raised with, which is it's everywhere. It's worse up north. Slavery wasn't that bad. Our family never mistreated their slaves. From my grandmother, I'm ashamed to admit. And
Mm.
I've gotten, well, look, they got equal footing. What's the problem?
Yeah.
That whole idea. Um, and it's been a journey to deconstruct that, going back to arriving in, it started in school and when I was still at home, but really college. And, then of course I became a historian. The South, I'm with you. It's very complex. What your South is not actually necessarily my South, is not somebody else's, which is crazy. But then we all sort of identify, no, I'm a Southerner, and I got to put up with all this nonsense. Or like there's a type of us here who see through the bullshit we've been taught.
Hmm.
We've lived through it, right? Like you as a black man.
Hmm.
Um, we found the ways that we have connected. And this has just been a phenomenal conversation, Sean. I'm glad I reached out. Glad we had time.
Me too, man.
Um,
Before the solo is Dickie Betts's rhythm. That rhythm, his rhythm guitar on that during that solo, where you could just see him, kind of go into this, like, Sufi mystic Nirvana mode, because the rhythm part is so incredible, and it's so simple, but again, it's sympathetic, and to me, that kind of is where I am now. I'm not a slide player. I don't play like Dwayne. I'd love to. I've got short, stubby fingers. I'm not a slide player, but you know what, man? I will support you, and I will support the vision of the song by comping and just doing that beautiful rhythm part. It's two chords, right? I mean,
yep.
and you just you feel you feel how Dickie goes like up and down. It's just like these. It's just like waves. It's just like
If
this
you
beautiful
want to
wave, and
hear,
then he holds back. It's just beautiful.
it is wonderful. And I'll tell you, I know exactly the parts you're talking about, because that's how I play Dreams. When I'll put a vamp on and I'll just record, or I'll just listen to them and I'll vamp his parts.
Yeah, love it.
Crazily enough, uh, that is Dwayne playing the part Dickie wrote, because Dickie hated the studio so much when he first got there. He freaked out and apparently like threw his guitar down and left. And so Dwayne recorded that particular part, which is Dickie's. Like every time you listen to it, that's exactly how Dickie plays it. And so I will commend to you 9/19/71 SUNY Stony Brook.
Oh, I love that version. Yes.
Okay. The what Dickie's comping on that, and then what they do, they go into Mountain Jam, that part of Mountain Jam that we talk about that we love so much. They go into that territory where it's all
Yes.
six of them. It's always, if I find them, it's like this. Yeah, man. What do you think? Yeah, here. Oh, yeah. Hell yeah.
Yeah.
Like, okay, yeah. And it's like this conversation. And it's like, to me, Dwayne's career is always going to be a what if, right? He was flamed like a comet.
Yeah, man.
But man, what they started doing with Dreams at the end of his life, with just that one example, and all those Dickie riffs, because that's exactly what you're talking about. Is that's the second thing that got me, with maybe third thing. First was the great guitar solos.
Yes.
Second was probably the ensemble, the Greg. But when you start breaking it down, it's like, oh, the bass. Wow, what's that doing?
Yeah.
Oh
What's
my
he
God,
doing? He's in
the
Charlie Mingus territory,
the
man. Jack
guitar,
Cassidy.
yeah, and yes, and so it's like you've got all of these pieces that make the whole, and you know, there's a lot of ways you can think about how you support your role, of the principle, you know, like you like, are you George Harrison and I've Got a Feeling, right? Where he's just laying down some really killer licks.
He is.
Or I'll tell you a crazy one. Man, we could just keep talking all day, but I'll tell you a crazy one. For years, I thought when I was watching the rooftop concert, I thought that George was the one that was playing the leads on Get Back. So
Oh,
whenever they would show George and you'd hear the guitar, I'd be like, oh, they've overdubbed that.
yeah.
And when I saw the full movie and paid more attention, I'm like, well, wow, that's Johnny Lennon doing
That's
that,
right.
doing those Chuck Berry riffs. And um there's a sequence in that movie. You know, you talked about adding Billy Preston the last time we talked and whether or not they could have, you know, sort of diversified the band and done something, etc.
Hmm.
I had two thoughts, and I'm gonna leave you with these, and then we're gonna talk about these the next time. 2 years, 6 months, whatever it is,
Who
right?
knows, brother?
Two things. One is yes to that. Like there's a sequence during I think it's Get Back when Lennon plays his solo, turns around, and they're showing it Paul and John, and Lennon sort of comes around, and they both kind of bounce at the same time. They're like,
Yes.
it's like you said, we're doing this, and you could see the joy in John's face because, of course, Paul never lost his love of being a Beatle and was always just going to push
Hmm.
them. The rest of them, well, George and John were tired. Ringo was going to go with whatever, right? So, like, what if they had decided, let's go out and do this? And what we could have gotten. Here's another side what if for you that is a deep cut. What if the band had agreed to only be a studio band for a couple of years and then go out and tour without Robbie Robertson, like Brian Wilson used to do with the Beach Boys? Like the band had two examples. They had how the Beatles got off the road, and then they had the Beach Boys, you know, Resident Genius did this. Because Robbie Robertson was clearly scared in The Last Waltz, in everything he's written. And then, of course, the damage his bandmates had done. You know, freaking Rick Manuel almost killed his wife and
Yeah.
baby, you know,
Yeah.
or, you know, what if they'd have done that? And that's really what Robbie says in his book is like, hey, so there's one for you. Like we got the Beatles, the two real counterfactuals here.
You know, that's interesting because, you know, you know, talking about the band, you know, and how, you know, and you know, all of them wanted to keep going, right? You know, and you just leave on Helm is seething through
Yep.
that whole film. He's just livid,
Yep.
you
Yep.
know, and
Yep.
and you know, it's also interesting in that film and in that, you know, the soundtrack and everything. Le- Levon is the only sober person in the band. Like everybody is coked out, and I think they, you know, everybody had to overdub some part of the last waltz except for Levon. Like he was just precise because he was the only one. Maybe he had a beer or two, but he wasn't doing
Mm-hmm.
lines backstage. But it is interesting because, and that's the other thing is Robbie Robertson is not a singer. You know, they turn his mic down. It's
Yep.
and why would you need to be when you've got Levon Helm, Rick Danko, Richard Wright? I mean, three of the best, most underrated rock vocalists in all of history, right? And you know, there is something to be said about okay, we'll you know, we'll do like the Beach Boys. You stay home, Robbie. You do your soundtracks with Scorsese and write the songs, and we'll meet you back at Xanadu or whatever they call their studio, and we'll do that, and maybe we'll get Clapton because remember Clapton very famously said in his Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction, I always wanted to be in the band. And in fact, I drove up to the Big Pink, you know, and I was going to ask, and I lost the guts. I lost the courage to do that. Well, Clapton would have been perfect to kind of fill that role. You
Yeah.
know, and Clapton
Yeah.
had already done side projects, you know, that Blind Faith and Derek and the Dominoes. So he would have been perfect as a Robbie Robertson doppelganger. And Clapton can sing, so and Clapton too didn't care about he wasn't about ego. He
Not
never
not at that
wanted to
point. He
be
was all done with all that bullshit, you know, by that
yeah.
point.
not
That's
just a
actually, I
guitarist.
hadn't even plugged Clapton into that mix, because of course, Eric Clapton just wanted to be JJ Cale or Delaney Bramlett,
That's right. That's right,
and
man. He wanted to hide in Delaney and Bonnie and friend. Like he
yep,
just,
be a part
I
of a
just want to.
band.
I want to be a fourth chair guitarist, man. I love this
Yeah,
music. So for the Beatles, I think the four of them, and you see that specifically in Get Back, the four of them have such a synergy. They are so locked in, that they could not see anybody else being in the band, and so like for Billy Preston to be an almost Beatle is a big deal because he just fit for them at the time. I I also think this in the anthology. I mean, it was a full like all for one for all. Like if one person didn't like it, we ain't doing it. So that's why like like Harrison did not want to perform live. And
right.
they kind of pressured him. Like let's just I love that scene. Like I don't want to go on the roof. And I think John kind of just basically that's right. There's a sequence that's not on film where the four of them right before they go on, they're still debating about whether or not to go up on the roof. They are still debating about this. And then finally Lennon says, "Fuck it. We're going on the fucking roof and we're going to fucking play. Fuck all of you. Let's go." Again, leader, he was the leader. Like this is what we're doing. And shut up, George. You're doing it. And we'll be done with it. But I love the part at the end of that film, or the scene, and I'm so glad they captured that, where they all listen to the playback, and you just see the
Yep.
joy. Like,
Yep.
wow.
That
Imagine
that's
hearing that recording for the first time in Apple Recording Studios, unedited, unmixed, hearing that through those speakers in the moment. And you just see like they're all even Yoko's grooving like, wow, we
yeah,
did something.
even Yoko's not stopped frowning well, she's still frowning for just a minute.
Yeah,
Um, oh, Sean, man, we could just keep going.
we could,
I'm
brother.
grateful. I wish I hadn't cut off the health thing, but I did, because that would have been good stuff to throw in for people to
That's
think
okay, man.
about.
I'm an open book about that. Don't worry about it.
Yeah,
Thank you for
should have
asking.
I should have just gone through and just kept recording it. And I pulled it off because I think that could be helpful. God bless your family. I love following you online. Keep in
Likewise,
touch.
brother.
Keep on trucking. And all right, hey, how can people find you? That's the one I wanted to finish with. When you're online or your various efforts,
Instagram, LinkedIn, and my website, SeanGaillard.com.
Sean Gaillard. Okay. And
That's
do
it.
you identify with us? Like, was it Sean Gaillard of the blah, blah, blah podcast how do you have a specific one you want me to point to?
Nah, I mean, well, Vinyl Riffs. That's the one I'm trying to get up and going. So Vinyl Riffs with Sean Gaillard. That's the podcast to follow. That's the one I'm dealing with the most. And then Leading While Human. Those are kind of like my two main projects right now. And but then for the blog and all that stuff, I got a little homemade website. I got to do something better with it. But
I got you.
SeanGaillard.com is
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. I got you. I got you covered. And hey, listen, if you're ever doing or submitting leadership proposals for conferences or even chapters and stuff, and you think about like, hey, wonder if BD could pull something together on any of these leadership lessons like Dwayne or even like Derek Trucks, Warren Haynes, like
Oh my
I've got
gosh,
in my
yeah.
mind some sort of idea and I may do it myself, but just, as it comes up, I love to do presentations. I love, publishing is part of my skill set, I'm on 4 books now and trying to think about the 5th and trying to think about something for play all night, to goose some sales, but just keep me in mind, man.
You
And
got it, brother.
proud of the
And
your
likewise,
beautiful
everything I
family.
can do to help and support you, Bob. I really appreciate you. Much love and blessings to you and your
Yeah.
family. And let's keep hitting the note.
Yes, sir. Happy rebirth day. My 55th birthday was last week, so I
Oh,
will
happy
probably
birthday,
always
man.
remember
Awesome.
this. So, because my wife's birthday is the 23rd. So, yeah. All right. God bless my best to your family, and we'll meet in touch one of these days. We'll be in
You
person.
got it, man. It's gonna
Keep
happen.
on trucking.
You too, brother. Thanks. See ya.